Please, John chapter 21. Please join me there. Verse 15, chapter 21. Follow as I read, please, and join me in a moment. So when they had eaten breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me more than these?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." He said to him, "Feed my lambs." He said to him again the second time, "Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." He said to him, "Tend my sheep." He said to him the third time, "Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me?" Peter was grieved because he said to him the third time, "Do you love me?" And he said to him, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep." Would you read with me through verse 22, reading? "Most assuredly, I say to you, when you were younger, you girded yourself and walked where you wished. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will gird you and carry you where you do not wish." This he spoke, signifying by what death he would glorify God. And when he had spoken this, he said to him, "Follow me." Then Peter, turning around, saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following, who also had leaned on his breast at the supper, and said, "Lord, who is the one who betrays you?" Peter, seeing him, said to Jesus, But Lord, I lost my place. "But Lord, what about this man?" Jesus said to him, "If I will that he remain till I come, what is that to you? You follow me." Yesterday I made a phone call. I wanted to ask one of the pastoral staff who I thought was home in the afternoon what R and R, so commonly used. Say, let's go away for R and R, what it meant. Now, I thought I knew, but I wanted to verify it because I didn't want to make a fool of myself getting up here and say it meant one thing that it didn't, because I had an opinion for what it meant. And I was glad I made the call. The pastoral staff member wasn't available right at the time, but his college-age son was there. And I said, "What does R and R stand for?" "Man, just like the kid says, rest and relaxation." And I said, "Well, you know, that's really interesting." I said, "That's not what I thought, but I'm going to accept that." And what I thought it stood for was rest and recuperation. Rest and recuperation. And I knew it had stood for that once, but things have a way of changing, giving the passage of years, especially as many years as since it was that I came to hear what R and R stood for. And I realized why there was the change. It was because of the culture, and R and R continued to be used today, so that socially it is generally meanings today, rest and relaxation, a time of breakaway, after a time of great intensity. First time I ever heard R and R, I was just a little kid. It was during World War II, and when troops were taken back from the front line of battle, they went back for R and R, and it was for rest and recuperation. And I realized that in the intensity of warfare, as compared with just the tensions of ordinary life, that rest and recuperation would be far more essential a term, and what time would be given to in a warfare situation, where just in the pressures of life, rest and relaxation would be a little more appropriate. R and R. It's a time of break from, whether it's intense warfare and incorporates the need for recuperation, or relaxation after there's just been times of pressure, so that we have a kind of a vacation time. The reason that the two letters were on my mind in this last message of our series on the Easter countdown, and we've counted through and beyond now, we come to this chapter 21 of the Gospel of John. We've been through many of the portions of John's Gospel leading to the cross, coming to the resurrection day, and now days after, in fact, a couple of weeks after the resurrection is when the episode occurs that we've just read. 21st chapter of John has a broader context of the setting for the conversation we just read between Jesus and Peter. And I want to talk about the larger context because it gives dimension to the conversation and why that was so significant. But the reason that the disciples were up there in Galilee for this meeting with Jesus was because of the need for R and R. It had been an intense, not just 2 weeks that had been since the resurrection, and certainly the 2 weeks prior to it, incorporating the crucifixion, the events that we studied several weeks ago of the the resurrection of Lazarus and all that entailed of a confrontation. It had been more than those 4 weeks. It had been, in fact, 6 months since they'd left Galilee and headed south. When Jesus had said, we're going to Jerusalem where the Son of Man will be taken with evil hands, crucified and slain. And they had gone on that journey that incorporated a great deal of ministry, a great deal of increasing tension, and finally the cross and the resurrection and the post-resurrection glory, which was crowded about with the possibility of an assault, a counterattack of those that had put Jesus to death and arranged for his death. So it was not a tension-free environment. Jesus had said to a group of his disciples, while Peter was not present, he said, "Go up to Galilee." And he'd said, "Tell the disciples," for not all of them were there, "tell the disciples," and Jesus specifically said, "and Peter, that I will meet them in Galilee." Now, if you've ever been to Galilee, and then you've probably been to Jerusalem too, and you know, just for general purposes, it's a far more restful environment. It's the agricultural part of the country. It's more refreshing. You're close to the slopes of Mount Hermon, and the breezes of that highest mountain in the Middle East, the 9,000-foot Mount Hermon, snow-capped much of the year. The breezes come down the Jordan Valley, and it's a refreshing area, not to mention the beauty of the Sea of Galilee and the whole surrounding agricultural area. Jerusalem is far more intense, and it's dry. The hillsides are rocky. It's a far greater temperature, and much of the time higher temperatures. And so it was a refreshing place to go in that regard. It was get away from Jerusalem, for it was in that religious capital that there was greater possibility of the counterattack that could take their lives. And then it was a place where they'd spent so much time with Jesus. "Tell my disciples and Peter that I'm going before them into Galilee." And they'd come. And days had passed and Jesus hadn't shown up. You can read about this in the first 15 verses of the Gospel of John. As a matter of fact, verse 14, just prior to what we read, says that this is now the third time that Jesus appeared to his disciples after his resurrection. That's the third time to the larger group. He had appeared a number of times to smaller groups and to individuals. There are about 10 occasions in the Bible where Jesus appears to people after his resurrection. So we're not dealing with phantom appearances, guesswork, or imagination. We're dealing with realities, especially given in chapter 20, the encounter where Thomas said, "Nobody's going to talk me into this. If I don't just put my finger right there where the wounds were, my hand where the spear went in," he said, "you're not going to get me to believe this stuff." And that's why the person we call Doubting Thomas, who became Believing Thomas, we can be very thankful for it, because he tested the most skeptical, the most cynical, the most pragmatic rationalist who would say, "I want more proof than just ideas." There's not any more historically established reality in human history than the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And it's not my call here this morning or effort to convince you of it, because for the most part we know the reality of the resurrection by reason of the fact the living Christ has come to dwell in our lives, and we know by the ministry of the Spirit this is real. But I want to say that if there's anyone that wonders about the issue, that it's only a matter of passive insincerity on the subject that would lead a person to draw any other conclusion than this is a reality. No one should reject Jesus Christ on the proposition that the resurrection is a myth. Nobody should. It's a ridiculous proposition. You can reject Jesus Christ for any number of other reasons if a person chooses to. Reject him because you don't want to make a commitment, because you don't want to submit your life to the will of God, because you feel you don't need a Savior and you'll manage life on yourself. Reject him for any number of reasons. Reject him because you don't like things that have been done in his name, even though many things done in his name are not worthy of his name and unfortunately besmirch the credibility of his name. But the real Jesus survives nonetheless. But don't ever reject Jesus because you suppose the resurrection is just an idle notion of imagination of people. This is real. And this was the third time he'd met these after the resurrection. And it's a very, very significant encounter that gives us reason for the title of our message this morning, Post-Resurrection R&R. But I'm not referencing their return to Galilee for rest, recuperation, relaxation, or recreation for that matter, because it turns out that way, it appears, but it wasn't that. I'll explain in a moment. But first, let me say the R&R that I'm talking about isn't any of those terms. In this episode, there are reminders. And where the reminders are received, there are releases. And that's the R&R that I want us to capture this morning in these few remarks I have to make from this text we've just read in the Word of God. Resurrection R&R, reminders and releases. Let me begin by noting what takes place around that fire on the beach when Jesus says, Peter, do you love me? There's all kinds of pathos in and around this story, all kinds of drama that is played into it. What has just happened only minutes before was there had appeared a person on the shore calling to the disciples who were out on a boat fishing. They were there fishing because hours before, Peter, weary of waiting, supposing Jesus isn't going to come, and I want to talk about that in a moment, supposing, no, he said he was going to meet us here, and he's not here. I'm going fishing, he says. You read it in the first 3 verses of chapter 21. I'm going fishing. And they went fishing. Peter said he was going fishing. He didn't say, hey guys, let's go fishing. The implications of his words, by the way, are of significance, because the whole of the text makes clear Peter was not saying, I'm going out for a night of recreation. We'll just go see how they're biting. That's not what he's saying. Peter's saying, when this all started, I was a fisherman. I'm going to go back fishing. That's what Peter's saying. And this is not my interpretation. A study of the text in depth makes this clear. Now, I want to make clear, I don't think Peter was saying, I'm through with Jesus. I don't think he's saying, I don't believe. But there's no question that he is saying something that is rooted first in the disconcerting sense of the residue of guilt and failure because of you remember the last thing that happened. I mean, the last thing that really seriously involved him. It was the night before Jesus was crucified, and Jesus said, they're going to come and get me, and when they do, all of you are going to flee. And Peter said, not me, Lord. Not me. I'll stand with you no matter what happens. And Jesus said, Peter, you're going to deny me 3 times before this night is over. And Peter still said, that's not on your life. But he had. And when Jesus said, tell my disciples and Peter, what Jesus was clearly saying was, tell the disciples, and by the way, when you tell them to go up to Galilee, be sure and tell Peter too, because I know Peter, he's very liable to think that I don't include him when I say for the disciples to go up. He'll think that he's outside the circle now because of his failure. You tell him I want him to be there too. The love of Jesus, but the human inclination to doubt. Now, Peter had been there when he'd seen the preceding 2 occasions of the appearance of the Lord after the resurrection with the larger group. When he is going north to Galilee, because your mind has done this too. His mind had to have somehow, he said, tell the disciples and me. I suppose the guys told me that they think that he meant, that he didn't want me to think I wasn't included because of my failure. But, how do I know he didn't mean tell my disciples and tell Peter too, even though he's not a disciple anymore? Even though he stumbled so far, if he denied me, he's chosen his circle. But at least tell him if he wants to be there that we can negotiate terms all over again. It's possible to think that because there's not one of us in this room that haven't felt like we've so betrayed the trust that the Lord has given us to be his person in a given situation and fumbled the ball so miserably that you just feel like, well, God probably loves me, but I feel terribly disqualified. And now they're up there and Jesus hasn't come. And it's a very easy thing for me to imagine. And Peter says, guys, there were 6 others of them. I'm going fishing. The last intention he has is for them to go with him. He says, I'm going fishing. And probably in his mind is something like this. Look, you guys, probably it's my being here with you that's keeping him from coming. If I just split out of here and go do what I'm probably capacitated for, I mean, I'll go do what I can do pretty well. He'll still always be my Messiah. He'll always be my Lord. But I'm going to go do what I know how to do. I don't understand the way things have gone these days. But I do understand fishing. I'm going to go do that. And they immediately say, we're going with you too. And